Jevan Soo Lenox, thank you for joining us today on the PLA podcast. We have known each other, I was thinking like over a decade now. And you had, at the time I met you, had started at Blue Bottle Coffee, the delicious coffee, as CPO. And I was not even in the people space yet. I was at Khan Academy as their chief of staff trying to figure out a bunch of culture and people things. And we met at this event that Google had put on back in the day called Rework. And Laszlo Bock was still in seat, and they had like amazing leaders. And you were seated next to me. And I was like, who is this brilliant person that I get to hang out with all day long? So you were stuck with me for the day. But that started off this wonderful decade of us being able to cross paths at all these serendipitous moments in time. Last year, you started your 5th CPO role. What do you love about this role that keeps you coming back? What gives you longevity as a CPO?
What has drawn me to the work from the start, I am a business generalist, so I didn't start in the people path. I started as a McKinsey consultant. I just found over time that I was always deeply curious about how you achieve business goals through the lens of kind of people and organization. And that problem solving and that specificity, the business challenges that a particular organization faces in terms of their strategy, in terms of their stage and size and so on. That's what keeps it fresh, because there is actually quite a bit of people stuff that is repetitive, right? You're building processes and some of the problems, they do kind of repeat themselves over time. But for me, I'm an industry hopper, so I do lots of different industries. I jump size and stage frequently. And what's fun over time is you start connecting the dots and seeing patterns that aren't as obvious.
I love that. That dot connecting is such a skill in and of itself, and being able to come from these really broad contexts is so helpful. For our audience, do you mind sharing a bit more about your path and the different CPO roles that you've had over time?
Yeah, so I started my career as a baby consultant at McKinsey right out of college. I spent 2 years doing all kinds of different strategy and organizational projects, as one does, and just found that I was continually drawn to the people side of things. I was doing recruiting and training, all these sort of volunteer activities at McKinsey. And when I looked back, even in college, I was doing that. I had a paid job as a writing tutor. I volunteered in Chinatown, Boston, after school program for a semester. The career path wasn't as obvious to me if you didn't kind of like jump in right from the get-go. And so I started by just doing a 3rd-year rotation at McKinsey into their recruiting sort of organization. As you might imagine, for a consulting firm, the people stuff is really the product in many ways. And so they took it very, very seriously. They did a lot of machinery, a lot of strategy. What was supposed to be 1 year turned into 2 years. And it turns out that's actually a pretty amazing first people job, because, the core problem was, how do you figure out in 45 minutes or so whether someone's a great fit for a pretty challenging job? What are the ways to get to that sort of insight? And then they asked me to move to Shanghai and take over kind of a wide range of recruiting initiatives and strategy across Asia Pacific, 12 countries, really dynamic, fast-growing region. This is 3 years leading up to the Beijing Olympics, so just an incredible time for the region, very entrepreneurial, very exciting, very optimistic. And at that point, I had been at McKinsey 7 years, so let's break up and see how we feel. So I went off to graduate school, did an MBA in public policy degree, all focused on leadership, public education, and then realized that I really had a calling to be an operator and to go into high growth companies. That Asia stint really sort of made me realize I liked being in the mess. Like, I liked being where things hadn't been figured out yet, and then you kind of had to problem solve in a really fresh way. And so I jumped to Square in my first operating job outside of McKinsey, in their crazy hypergrowth time, doubling headcount every 6 to 9 months, a few years pre-IPO, first time working with a celebrity founder, first time working with all the engineers, made tons of mistakes, learned from those mistakes. And then I took my first chief people officer job at Blue Bottle Coffee, also in their hypergrowth years, a few years prior to the acquisition by Nestle. I started with fintech, then I went to food and beverage. Then I went to Minted and Stitch Fix, which is e-commerce. Stitch Fix was my big job. That was 10,000 people at our peak. Led a team of about 100 by the time I was done there, public company for the first time. And followed that up by going to an AI biotech in Citro, the smallest company I'd ever been at, 150 people. My last 2 companies have all been AI-oriented, so Stitch Fix for retail, e-commerce apparel, and Citro for biotech drug discovery. And now I'm at Writer, which is a broad-based agentic AI platform for enterprise big companies, think Fortune 500, and helping them really realize ROI in ways that they don't always from other products.
It's an incredible breadth of experience and depth of experience that you bring to the table. And for folks who are maybe thinking about, should I stay or should I go in a role? Like, how have you known or decided when to make career moves or transitions between those roles?
Yeah. Pretty early on in my McKinsey career, someone gave me a very sort of simple rubric that I think stands the test of time. And it's, do you feel like you're having great impact? Do you feel like you're learning and growing? And are you having fun and like the people that you're with? Ideally, it's all three. It better be at least two. If it's just one for a sustained amount of time, you should do some hard thinking. And if it's none of them, you should, right? You got to get something out of it. The team piece is probably more sustained, because if you're doing a good job up front, sort of screening what organization you join, and if you're a leader who gets to build your own team, then hopefully you're doing a good job of that. But the learning and growing thing, I think, is really specific and dynamic, and having impact is tricky too, because I think in some ways there's arguably a negative correlation. Like the stronger team you build, the more I'm like, oh man, I'm kind of out of a job. Like I made the analogy of one of my previous companies that I kind of feel like the Mary Poppins of people in organization, right? I come in, try to heal the family, and then they're good say, like, oh, it's time for me to fly away with my umbrella to another house.
Is there a duration that you let it go on for? Like, if you have only one of the three or zero of the three, forbid, how long before you're like, this is too long? There's so many ups and downs in the role, and they're hard, really hard days where I think many of us are like, just throw in the towel, please. I cannot do this anymore. But for you, how do you think about that sort of tenacity element of it?
Yeah, a quarter is often a blip and up and down. So it's not to dismiss the signal, but it's sort of say any given quarter could be up and down. 2 quarters in a row, 6 months is probably when my ears perk up. And I'm like, I'm feeling this way about this thing for a while. And then I think 3 or 4 quarters, it starts being a thing, right? And so one of the patterns I feel later in career is an earlier sense of pattern recognition of my own sort of reactions to these things. So I would say in a previous company, I basically said this next year will be my last year because I feel the learning and growing declining. I feel the impact declining and so on. But that's actually more healthy than I think earlier in my career, where I was less maybe sort of self-aware, or I just had less pattern recognition. And so it's more all of a sudden, maybe it kind of sneaks up on you and all of a sudden you're like not happy or I'm not fulfilled or whatever it is. And it just kind of takes you a little bit by surprise. Here, I sort of feel like I kind of see ahead much more. And that allows me, I think, to still sort of bring my best work to the table along the way and to just have a longer range view on what's the best way to think about a potential transition and setting the team up for success and, and what's right next for me.
Really appreciate you sharing that rubric. You were kind enough to join the People Leader Accelerator annual retreat, and you were part of a small group of experienced, successful chief people officers. I'd love to try to get as many as possible, some of those golden nuggets for our listeners who are mid to senior level HR leaders that are looking to grow in their career. What are some of those best nuggets that would be helpful to them?
I was telling someone the other day that there are these interesting sort of, I don't know if they're negative correlations or sine curves or whatever the shape is, but these things about my first chief people officer role or second that are really different. And it's not all actually necessarily improvement. It's some things actually, I have to try to return to that. Earlier on, I was more courageous. I personalized it so much more. It's not that I'm not emotionally invested now. I am, but I think I felt a deep sense of, I have to fix this problem. I have to fix this team dynamic. I have to make sure this leader doesn't fail and so on. And it felt sort of so deeply connected to my sort of identity and my sort of worth of whether that success was true or not. And I think over time, I've recognized I have done all that I can. And people in organizations are messy and complicated. Over time, I've developed a healthier balance of still being invested, still caring deeply, but actually still having an appropriate remove. And I feel like when I talk to people earlier in this work, I see that a lot. This just sort of, they're emotionally running hot and you can see the danger of burnout and people talk about this. And so how do you keep that care? How do you keep that passion? But how do you protect yourself in an appropriate way? That's a lesson that I think has come over time.
Really helpful. I heard be courageous. And in a moment, I'd like to peel that back a little bit further to like, how can you push yourself to be courageous if you're in your first top job or trying to rise? Second, I heard don't let yourself get stuck in your ways, being complacent with the same way that we've always done things. I imagine as you've changed contexts from industries and sizes and stages, I don't know, maybe that's been less of a risk because it's been such a departure from job to job. And third, I heard have some professional distance to a certain extent. Within People Leader Accelerator, sometimes I talk about the concept of 2 toots and a salute. I don't know where it came from. I don't know if I borrowed it or coined it myself. The concept is if you are working with a CEO or someone else in power, chain of command, and they want you to do something, a toot is a pushback or a redirection of some sort. So, my example is usually the CEO went to some meeting with the investor, a bunch of other CEOs over the weekend. They come in on Monday and they want to do something crazy. That's a terrible idea. And you as the HR leader might say, well, that's interesting. Let's look more into it. Or can we put that in the parking lot? And they say, no, I'd really like us to get to work on that. You get a second toot, and that toot is your last one. Because you don't want to present as an adversary to the person that you're trying to support. And they have the decision-making rights on whatever it is, if they're the CEO. So at that point, after your second toot, it's your responsibility as a good follower to execute to the best of your ability and not undercut it later. So you get 2 redirections or points of resistance, but after that, get on board and do your best to make it successful, and then you can do an after action later without being a jerk about it.
That's very fair. There's probably a rare moment where I say this is a 3-alarm toot situation. But a lot of times I'll literally sort of say, right, I was like, look, this is a judgment call. I do have a difference in opinion. I owe it to you to give you that. Reasonable people can differ. One thing actually that you did spark for me, Andrew, that I think I definitely have grown over time in, it's not true of everybody, but I think one, not uncommon archetype for chief people officer is deeply empathetic, wants to help other people succeed, and then therefore maybe doesn't want to say like the hardest things to sort of do the work really well. I went to this, sort of weekend coaching workshop, and I sort of acknowledged, I was like, look, this is something that I actually don't think I'm as amazing at as I would like to be. And the coach sort of gave me this frame that has really stuck with me, which is the next time you are going to one of these hard conversations, just imagine yourself with a sword and say to yourself, you are a warrior for truth. And it kind of really stuck with me. Some of my former exec colleagues have a joke now. They're like, I know you're about to give me like brutal feedback, because I'll say, I care about you, and that I want you to be successful at XYZ. So, and they're like, oh man. But it's authentic, I really am saying it from a place of care and an understanding of what drives them and what they seek. And so I owe it to them to say this unbelievably hard thing where I think they're getting in their own way or that they're really risking something.
Well, the framing around that is so valuable. You're verbalizing your commitment to that person 100%. Rather than standing in your own righteous indignation
100%
that this is right or this is wrong and your own sense of moralism in some way. It's more about, I care about you. I care about our success as an organization. Here's something that's tough for me to say, might be tough for you to hear. And here's something that I think would benefit all of us if I share it. That's courage. And that's maybe smart courage. It's positioning in a way, hopefully to have the best likelihood of retaining the relationship along the way.
And it pulls out something I think is missing from almost every feedback framework I've seen. I talk to clients a lot about that 1 or 2 sentences of context you give right before you say the thing. Whatever you say in those 2 sentences can totally change how someone interprets it. Like, I care about you and here's something hard. And if you don't change it, this is going to be a really tough place for you to be long-term. It's very different than, what's a nice thing for you to like maybe experiment that might take you from good to great. And then you say the exact same paragraph, totally different. And so I love that you frame it up front with like the care, that's radical candor of care and the truth of it.
That professional distance, professional detachment, I don't think that's the best description for it, but there's some professionalism to this is the craft. I am the subject matter expert in this area. It's my responsibility in the domain to do as best as I can as your advisor in this arena. I have this beautiful letterpress card from Marie Such. And the concept is in HR, we often, unfortunately, serve as a sponge for all the emotions of an organization and a leadership team. And it was a reminder with that, beautiful, thick cardstock letterpress colander to try to let some of that emotion run through us rather than just absorbing it.
That is a much better framing than the one that I have used. So mine is similar, but more negative. So I have sometimes explained to my CEOs in a hard time or so on that the chief people officer is the rain gutter of the organization. Everything flows through them. They catch everything. Beautiful, clean, pristine rainwater comes out the other side, and you are left covered with detritus and sticks and mud and, dead bugs or whatever.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, yours might just be more in reality, right? The grittiness of the reality of the situation.
But you gotta shake it off. My CEO at Stitch Fix, Katrina, is still a dear friend. She said, "You probably know the organization the best, other than me. You see everything." And that's a wonderful thing in many ways and a really, really hard thing in many ways.
Yeah, it's super hard. On that, I'm wondering, do you have ways that allow you to release or detox from some of that? I think so many of us who go into this work is because we're really good sponges and we think we can hold a lot. And the role just often is just so much that there is this burnout, there's this overwhelm that comes. But what have you done to be able to let that rainwater flow through you?
Yeah, I'll give you a few boring cliches and then I'll give you something that maybe is more specific. I've realized I need to be healthy. I need to be exercising. I am someone who just, buries myself in work. And so now with 2 young kids, that's just not the kind of parent I want to be and the person I want to be. And so that is a forcing function of just sort of trying to create some boundaries. And I really like to cook. I'm in a monthly cookbook club with a bunch of friends. And so that forces me at least once a month to just unplug. And so those things are, I think, kind of more obvious. The thing that I think is maybe less obvious that I've realized over time is I personally think it's harder to make good friends at work once you're a chief people officer. For a while, for a number of these CPO roles, I sort of said, well, that's fate. And then I'll give her credit for this. Heather Dunn, who's a really dear friend, chief people officer at Brex, she and I were talking about different relationships we've had at work once we've ascended to leadership and different relationships with CEOs and so on. And she said, Jevan, one thing that I've really realized is even in this role, we need our people too. Depending on the team, it can be different people. Katrina and I became very, very close friends at Citrix. We're still in each other's lives in a big way. And my current company, I have a wonderful CFO named Roger, wonderful general counsel named Rowan. You can imagine that trio functions needs to be super tight, and it's not always super tight. And so when you find it, you grip. I instituted a quarterly dinner that, for irony's sake, we call the G&A bro dinner because we are not broy at all. But I was just kind of like, I really like these people. And because of our roles, we actually can confide in each other in ways that I couldn't necessarily with another executive colleague and so on in the same way and so on. And I'm going to lean into that relationship. I'm going to lean into that friendship. And by the way, that actually pays dividends in terms of our professional work too, because we're becoming closer and more vulnerable with each other and all that good stuff.
It's so true, though. The relationships, I was even thinking about my first CPO role, and my direct reports were very close with each other, and they were like besties. And I was so jealous because I wanted to be in it with them, and I knew I couldn't. Otherwise, it didn't quite work in the workplace. And so I love that you kind of have found your bestie group at that executive level. When you were looking for this role at Ryder, how did you go about your selection process? What were questions that you asked, how that has evolved, and what was your approach this time around?
As someone who started in a generalist kind of business background, has spent time in kind of revenue, sales operations, and so on, there's a whole set of questions that I call investor questions. So they're just really hardcore about the business model, about the finances, and so on. And if that's your wheelhouse, go deep. If you feel like you need help, phone a friend from your network, you should do that, because a venture capital friend of mine said once, Jevan, I spread my investments across the vast range of portfolio and risk. You put all your eggs in one basket every single time. So in some ways, your diligence needs to be much better than mine. It's like, whoa. I had not been thinking about that way. And also I was like, oh, I should be asking you like really, really deep questions. My time is my money. And one of the things I would say, depending on where you are in your career, is essentially behavioral questions, particularly for the CEO, but sometimes for other executive colleagues as well. And they sound like questions that you would ask if you're interviewing a candidate yourself. Tell me about mistakes you've made. Tell me about XYZ challenges. Tell me about how you make this kind of decision and so on. Some CEOs get very bristly. They don't like that. That's actually a very easy first signal. Like, you're not going to like working with me because I'm going to ask these kinds of questions. I'm not going to be a jerk about it. I think it's part of my job to sort of poke my nose into stuff and be helpful and so on. Most of the time in an interview process, everyone is putting their best foot forward. And so I actually got feedback from a hire I once made. They're like, all your questions are just like, what's the biggest mistake? What's the hardest thing? And so on. I'm like, well, just like, the wins are already on the resume. I don't need to talk a ton about the wins. I want to hear about the hard stuff. Well, how are you going to do in those moments? What I love is when you see someone really pause and they really think and they come back with something and it's like, this is the relationship I want to have with someone, where they're just like willing to really reflect and talk about hard things. So there's this sort of, I call it reverse interviewing. Depending where you are in your career, your ability to ask those kinds of questions in where you are in the interview process really differs. Early on, I didn't know to ask these questions. But I realized, when you think about the power dynamic throughout an interview process, typically they're deciding whether they're into you. And as they're deciding that they're into you, and particularly when they're at state of offer, your ability to ask harder questions and so on opens up. The sense of risk of asking those questions goes down. Their openness to hearing those questions goes up. What I found that over time in my career with success is my ability to ask those questions earlier in the process has sort of changed. But my advice to people who are still building that track record, who are still finding their way on that, is you should ask those questions and have those answers by the time that you make your decision. Just know that when you get to ask them, you need to feel confidence in the answers to the questions that you care about.
I have one quick follow-up on this because I think it's so powerful. And you told me that one thing you also did was that you would give feedback to the CEO during the process to kind of test how they respond to it. Can you talk a little bit more about that and when in the process you sprinkle this in?
For me, the way I come to this job, part of it is being, sometimes people always say, like, the one person in the company who can give the CEO that feedback. I would say it's not feedback quite in the way of, you've been working together a while, I've got all this data. The way of framing it is, it's a provocative reflection, a provocative observation. I just kind of want to see how they roll with that. And often you see and hear interesting things in response.
I really appreciate the nuance around how to explore that fit. And by doing it this way, you're setting up the dynamic differently than if you are in, purely a subservient stance during the interview process. You're still speaking with your boss, the CEO, but it sets up the relationship a little differently based off of this approach. So that's likely to make for a better CEO, chief HR, chief people officer relationship along the way.
Yeah, to your point, Andrew, it's to their benefit too. If you don't want this, you'll get more of this. I'm giving you the vanilla version.
I think it's more nuanced and it's more practical than telling our listeners who maybe haven't had the first top job yet, or maybe they're a VP or a head of and they're looking for a chief. It's more helpful than saying, be courageous. Just do it. Just suck it up and ask these tough questions. Having some of the grit around, be thoughtful about how you frame it and be selective about when you introduce it. And that just sets you up as a more effective professional as well. If you're going to, go in guns blazing and not be thoughtful about the relationship, then maybe you're not ready for that chief level title yet.
Andrew, maybe another frame to add to that is trying to simulate what it's going to be like to work together. This is how I'm wired. This is how I do the job. So can I give you a taste of that and see how you react to that? And so for every one of your listeners, there's actually going to be a very different recipe than mine. I don't think actually the takeaway is everyone should try to give a provocative, spicy observation. If that feels right for you and that's how you operate or whatever, that could be amazing. But it could be something else. It could be that you are an incredible operational scaler and this is your thing. And so you sort of say like, here are speed bumps that I've seen in my most recent organization that I think are really important. I'd love to reflect with your take on where the company's on that, right? So you're really starting to showcase like, this is how I work. This is what drives me. All of us have interviewed candidates. It's really interesting to see what a candidate brings forward themselves proactively. That's different than how they respond to your question. I often sort of index on like, this is like what they focus on. Like they only have a few questions they can ask and this is what they chose, but that's a signal to me. And so the same thing, you're signaling, this is sort of a glimpse into my DNA. What does that say to you? Is that something that feels like it could be exciting?
I'm hearing know yourself, be authentic along the way, and be intentional with how you're approaching these, high impact conversations. Don't just let it happen.
I would also say just the amount of kind of pre-work of really reading up articles about the company. If it's going to report to the CEO, which I would highly recommend, then there's usually press the CEO has given. There's lots of background on them and so on. Like I'm really blessed at Writer because there's just a tremendous amount of content marketing. I could kind of come into these interviews like really armed, but also I would say, my bar for myself was pretty high because I just felt like I could skip over the basic stuff and go to more interesting things, but that requires the pre-work.
There's just like one question I'd love to dig into before we move into our accelerator round. AI is having a moment, maybe more than a moment. It's having an era. And you're at a AI first organization in Writer. You've been in the top HR seat a number of times in a number of different industries at sizes and stages. Can you just share with us and with our listeners, like what's different about being at a AI first organization?
What's similar about being an AI first company versus a company that is trying to retrofit is, there are a set of organizational outcomes. There are things about the humans in your organization that you still sort of care about in terms of their clarity, their growth and development, their motivation, all that kind of good stuff. What I think really becomes really different is just the way that you get to those outcomes. The most obvious thing, of course, is just you can rewire a ton of workflows and bring together technology and tools in ways you couldn't do before, much more technological leverage, things that people are kind of talking about. But what we're starting to really lean into, both internally as well as in conversations with our customers, I'm actually speaking to a customer next week about this, is just the broader rewiring truly of how organizations are structured. This increasing expectation that, really every individual in your organization is actually a manager. You're expecting them to have these like formally kind of managerial skills, zooming out and thinking about how work comes together across different sort of contributors, thinking about what sort of excellence looks like and checking in on that excellence and intervening and fixing things. You actually give feedback to agents in a way. And so all of a sudden, these are things that you sort of said before, they come later and they kind of compound over time, or you build a manager academy and people kind of go to it later. And all of a sudden it's very, I think, energizing and exciting, but a really interesting problem of this democratization of sort of managerial capability, I would argue. But I'm just starting to really wrap my head around, similarly, just the idea of, for many people traditionally growing in their careers is just around managing more and more human complexity in the organization. And now it's really managing complexity across sort of both human and agentic systems. And, one of the things that I would say I've really been pushing myself out of my comfort zone is imagination. Because again, this negative correlation of the more experienced you are, the more anchored you are by the reference points that you've lived through. And, all of a sudden it's sort of saying, oh, we could do anything. I thought actually an amazing customer success leader named Danny is taking my leaders through the best of our customer kind of workshop work for 3 hours tomorrow. And so much of it is around just like, here's the leading edge of the product. Like, I really want to spark your imaginations. So much of it to date has been substitution effect and just like plug in something here, plug in something there. And there are efficiency gains for sure. Increasingly, we're just seeing the really transformative value is pretty complex, cross-cutting workflows or things that you just fundamentally could not do before at all, and all of a sudden could be possible. It takes a very different part of the brain. It takes a very different sort of leadership mode, I think, to lead in this way. And I'm both excited, daunted, intimidated personally as I'm going through it.
There is something beautiful too, I think, as parents, as people who hang out with small humans, they are the most imaginative and they cause me, at least with my own experience, rethink about things constantly. The syntax that I use with them, like I asked my daughter, what are you working on? And her answer was a table. Because literally she's writing on a table. And so like working with agentic, AI, you're also being forced to rethink like, how do I ask a good question or what do I mean behind this? And I love what you're bringing forth too around the org implications of everybody now needs to manage because we're all going to be managing not just one agent, but potentially an entire team of agents to be able to maximize this technology. And so then from the people space, how do we then think about everyone's a manager? How do we build that skill set for people who've not done it before? And even the transition from managing a person to managing an agent is different as well. And so exploring the nuance of that. I know we need to get to this accelerator round, so we're going to just, pop our way through it. On the topic of growth mindset, if you could recommend a couple of resources that you lean on to learn from, what would you recommend to an emerging people leader about what would make the cut?
Ethan Malik is a professor at Wharton who writes and posts pretty frequently, does it in a way that's really accessible to the common person. His observations, I think, are really applicable, close to the ground. And then the second is a partner at Bain Capital Ventures named Sanya Oja. Similarly, just writes so incisively and cogently about the latest, news, the latest development. I really look to her in some ways for like, what's the latest and greatest? Like, what's the news in a way that feels more applicable than just kind of reading the headlines of a normal journalistic piece. Particularly if you're in tech, two canonical pieces are Work Rules by Laszlo Bock and Powerful by Patty McCord. Patty McCord was the original chief people officer of Netflix. And so, Netflix and Google did a lot of things that I think are kind of now deeply imprinted on tech HR in particular, high growth companies, particularly those in the Bay Area. There is something about those two from an ethos perspective. They're just like interesting and provocative and helpful framing for folks who are kind of finding their way.
Love it. And it's full circle because I think we got a copy of Laszlo's book at that Google event where we met.
There you go.
And I will agree, reading that actually hugely opened up my mind to like all their different experiments and what version of it do you believe, and sparked a lot of imagination of what could be done in the field. I also love that you're recommending from resources outside of HR as well to be able to inform about what do we think is happening in the industry and in AI in particular. Next accelerator round question is a short one. What one sentence of advice would you share with folks about how to accelerate a successful HR career in today's environment?
Know the business deeply.
Excellent. And last but not least, how can our listeners connect with you?
LinkedIn.
Wonderful. Jevan Soo Lenox, thank you so much for your immense wisdom and frameworks. Thank you to our listeners, and thank you, Jevan.
Thank you both.